You don't fix the fundamentals, you just merely
Yeah.
accelerate chaos.
These are not perfect tools, and so you need validation, you need expert judgment. Some people think that these things are going to take over the world tomorrow, and other people think that it's completely useless.
AI doesn't fix broken processes, it accelerates them. So if coding takes days, if your Salesforce data is messy, AI doesn't create efficiency. It just makes chaos happen faster. My name is Mike Sommer, and today on Heartbeat, I'm joined by Phil, a tech executive with 25 years of leading transformation across energy, oil and gas, pharma, and life safety. We're going to get into war stories, what actually makes Salesforce drive outcomes, and how to win big even when core technology is in a place to adopt AI. So this episode is about learning and earning confidence and not selling change. So Phil, thank you so much for joining.
No, no problem at all. Thanks for having me.
So maybe we can just start from the very beginning. Take us back. What path led you to where you are in your career?
Good question. There's a long answer and a short answer. When I was in high school, I wanted to be an artist, and I had to pick between there was an art careers class and an honors calculus class, and I was like, you know what? I've heard of starving artists, but I've never heard of starving engineers, and so I said, let me go into career in engineering. I went to school for that, and my college roommate wound up being a computer science major. And I spent a year in engineering, and he kept trying to convince me to join his company. It was a consulting firm. And he's like, Phil, I know you. You could walk circles around some of these folks that are working here. And so I made the switch to IT and haven't looked back in 20 something years. I've just been loving it. I can tell you that engineering did not appeal to me the way that IT has, for sure.
So in the world of IT, when you think of the word engineer, what kind of persona does that typically bring to mind?
As far as an IT engineer goes,
Yes.
yeah. So I mean, it's the combination sort of, the builder designer kind of thing, I guess. Probably why I felt like there were so many parallels between being a mechanical engineering, being an IT person, because there were quite a few transferable skills. So I was able to go from mechanical engineering to essentially IT engineering without anything other than a retooling of the skills that I needed. And again, as an engineering student, I went to NJIT. It was a very computer centric environment. Even back then, they gave you a desktop PC as part of your enrollment there. So everybody had a computer. And over the years that I was there, I just became very fluent with it. And so off I went.
Now, there's a term that's being thrown around right now called the forward deployed engineer, and it seems to be all the rage because Palantir is launching this in the field. Do you feel, based on your experience, that the typical individual, whether it be a consultant or someone working in the field, has an engineering mindset, or is this just a spin on positioning?
No, I don't believe that they all have an engineering mindset. I use the term a good technologist when I'm especially when I'm working with partners or working with vendors. I insist on working with good technologists, and I guess the translation to that would be people that have within their DNA engineering and architecture, right? I think that if you're not a good technologist, you can't marry business to technology. You basically are just a tactical implementer of code or implementer of systems or whatever. So I believe that engineering really requires you to have a broader understanding of how everything fits together. And if you're not doing that, then you have a fairly low ceiling.
I've also heard the term a forward deployed entrepreneur, which I thought was an interesting spin, in that taking someone who thinks differently, someone who doesn't abide by necessarily the frameworks that have been institutionalized for the past 20 years, but comes in and says, why are we doing it this way? Or how about we approach it this way? Do you think that's something that can be taught? Do you think it's needed? Or do you think it's a very small section of people that can do it?
That's a good question. In my experiences, I worked for really big companies and really small companies. And I would say that the experiences working with the smaller companies are really the training. When you talk about teaching people this skill set, if you're working for a company that has 150 employees or less, your singular ability to make a difference within the business is significantly more than if you worked for a company that had 10,000 or 100,000 employees. Your role is more broadly defined. Typically, resources are stretched thinner, and so everybody's more than happy to get a helping hand if you're able to contribute in some other functional area or some area within the business. And so I think it's critical. Personally, I think everybody should spend some time having to wear multiple hats because it just makes you better, makes you more adaptable, makes you more able to sort of organically join different projects. And if you change organizations, it allows you to add value much more quickly because you're thinking more like a business owner than you are just as, whatever the job title is that you have and just trying to transactionally get through that job.
Okay. Thank you for that. What's one transformation war story that you still think about because it changes or changed the way that you today lead?
So transformation war story, not every organization is in it to win it from the ground up, and so I would say that in a previous organization, there's typically these transformations occur because there's been some sort of a change in, at least in my experiences, some sort of a change in leadership or some sort of a change in ownership, right? A new perspective comes in. They have a recognition that technology can be a business enabler. And so then they say, all right, well, what do I have to do to effectuate that? And usually it's bringing in someone like me who can help steer the organization down that journey. Not everyone's up to that, and some organizations have the old guard that harken back to the good old days when none of that stuff existed. And so I would say that, one of the war stories I have specifically was around the implementation of I'm going to try and be abstract because I don't want to call any organization out, but the implementation of a finance system where the former system was very custom tuned to an old way of doing things. And as the organization has grown through acquisition and just sort of, when you put these systems in, you really want to maximize the value of the system, right? And so when you get to that point where you have to really decide how is this thing going to work, you need people that are thinking about the way the new system, the functionality and the benefits of the new system versus people that just want to create a facsimile of the old system, right? And so I have experienced that firsthand, and it's a painful route to go through. And from my perspective, it was just about finding champions that could then socialize some of the benefits and sort of get the ball rolling on people understanding why the change has to happen to begin with. Because some people just, they hang their hat every day and identify as my job is hitting this button 40 times a day versus what can you truly do to maximize your value in the business.
Going along that thread, we're going through what I would consider a step change in the entire ecosystem right now, where AI is coming in and it's allowing and sometimes forcing executives to rethink everything. When a CIO is looking at achieving that mandate of implementing AI or implementing efficiencies or leveraging these new tools that are available, where does that CIO or where do you believe the CIO goes, or who do they trust in order to give them an objective snapshot of reality so they can make a decision on what's right for them? Maybe you can just shine some light on where you see the path for people that need help. Where do they go? What do they trust?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time talking to folks about AI, and I'd say this, my role as chief information officer also morphed into chief education officer as it pertains to artificial intelligence, because there's so much nonsense out there. And there's so much misinterpretation of where things are right now in terms of the technology sort of evolution of AI. Some people think that these things are going to take over the world tomorrow, and other people think that it's completely useless, and so making sure that you have a clear understanding of the current state of where it is, for me personally, I had to really roll up my sleeves and start using stuff. I was vibe coding and I was trying different platforms, and I really wanted to understand what is hallucination, right? What does that really mean? I have the benefit of being a member of the Society of Information Management. And so I go to those chapter meetings and there's CIOs to my left and my right. And we spend a lot of time talking about that. And they also have sessions that really focus on AI. I think part of it is just injecting yourself into situations. There's tons of conferences and whatnot. There's injecting yourself into situations where you can be the most knowledgeable person on the subject. And then bringing that into the business and sort of like having those conversations with your functional leads and making sure that they understand the capabilities so that they don't have a perception that you're going to somehow be able to flip a switch and AI is going to remove 10 headcount or it's going to reduce some sort of a SG&A by 10% or something like that, right? It's really dependent on a lot of factors if you're going to be successful. So I don't know if I've adequately answered your question there.
You did. It's definitely something I'm seeing in the market as well, which is you can't make a decision unless you have a grounding of truth and unless you have a clear understanding on what current state is. Trying to apply AI or trying to apply new ways of doing things just doesn't work. Do you think clarity can be achieved internally? Meaning, do you think going around as the CIO or as a senior lead in a company, can you truly get a picture of what reality is? Or do you think sometimes you need an outside third party to come in who is truly there to uncover, almost like a doctor, of coming in and truly understanding, knowing what questions to ask to bring that truth to the surface so that then the team can evaluate things knowing that the information was almost untainted and truly raw? What do
Yeah,
you?
yeah. So it really depends, A, on your reputation in the business and on your relationships. My personal belief that bringing in a third party to try and tell a story that I could tell just as well, that's not necessary if you have the credibility to tell the story and everyone's going to listen to you anyhow, right? So, and I don't believe that a third party is going to come in and do anything more than parrot what I already want them to say, or it becomes just a bunch of catchphrases and fluff. I don't want to be unfair to folks that do this for a living because I'm sure there's folks out there that do really good assessments. But from my perspective, you're not doing your job well as a CIO if you don't already know your business and you can't already tell this story. You just have to be able to bring your organization along this journey. If you need a third party to come in and help you along with it, they should be helping you. They shouldn't be helping everyone else, right? But you're the tip of the spear. You've got to be the one who's driving any sort of an AI strategy or any sort of an AI awareness program or something like that. And if you need the help, then get the help. That's totally fair.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I ask this question is I was working with a CIO who recently joined a company, and he had to play the politics because knew and wants to make sure he's listening to everyone, but he needed a storyline to be able to pitch and almost to have that bucket of data and supporting evidence to then
Mhm.
frame and present that information accurately and succinctly for the different platforms. So it was bringing individuals who had deep experience in different areas to then surface that information in a world where you're dealing with very large platforms like Salesforce and ERPs and what have you. Do you feel that one person can have a good enough understanding, or do you think there's a need for specialization to come in and truly present that data set to a CIO so they can frame it in a way to support their vision?
Yeah, you're probably right. I might be speaking on the scars that I have in previous situations where third parties have come in and it's been a lot of money spent on a couple really fancy PowerPoint decks. But I think if the CIO is driving this, there's certainly expert credibility that is associated with bringing in people that are proven to have done this sort of thing in the past. And if it's in partnership with the CIO, then all it is just more ammunition to drive the strategy forward. So in that sense, yeah, I think that would absolutely be beneficial. I have not personally done that, but it really depends on where the organization is in its AI journey as well. Some organizations talk about it as an ethereal concept, right? This thing that they're going to try and do, and it's going to solve all these problems. And if there's not clarity on what you want it to do and you don't have a crawl, walk, run sort of approach, I think a year later, it's still just people talking about AI.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And the reason for me asking this question is there's a lot of disruption happening in the consulting slash management consulting sector. I've been hearing clients don't want to pay for hours. They do not want to have a junior MBA team come in and spend 6 months working on a PowerPoint presentation that a good prompt and some good contextual engineering can provide 80% of that value. And, let's just call it a day. For those who have had a lot of experience in deep understanding, a lot of industry or technology context, do you think there's a place for them in a world where maybe their job is evaporating, not because of AI, just because of market economies and just the shifting of this marketplace? Do you think that there's a place where there's a opportunity for them to leverage that skill set and bring value back to the business? Or do you think there's a need for a retooling if someone gets laid off or dehired?
Yeah. Again, I do believe that it's unique to every situation. I've been in situations where bringing in one of the big consulting firms has really given things a shot in the arm. Unfortunately, that's not the norm, right? That's the exception. At least in my experience, it's been often driven by folks that have an agenda, right? And they're just trying to sort of check a few boxes to bring in these folks to do this thing. I'm of the belief that if you're going to do something like that, you have to be very purposeful in what skills and what sort of knowledge and what experiences are you trying to tap into. And if you have a relationship with them already, just making sure that you're maximizing the value of that relationship, because to me, it's a difficult price tag to adjust at the end of the day. I always feel like I didn't get my money's worth in the times that I've done that sort of thing. And I feel like had I just been a little bit more resourceful, I could have accomplished a lot of the same ends. And part of it is, with my background, I've had so much exposure to these folks that I don't get wowed by the PowerPoint deck. To me, I feel like, and I've had people on my teams that can produce similar results. And if you have the right people, you almost get a better result because they know your business already versus someone coming in and pretending like they do.
That's fair enough. So let's go back onto some personal experiences that you've had. So what is one of the most expensive invisible problems that you've fixed? And what did it cost in time, money, or trust?
So invisible, in other words, by invisible, like something that only maybe the IT function or the CIO could see, where maybe the other functional leads or the leadership team did not see. Is that your definition of invisible?
Either from that side or from the leadership side, you were seeing something that no one else was, and maybe it hadn't hit the front line, but you saw that if this doesn't get fixed, it could be a major problem going forward.
So it brings to mind, when you have an organization that is moving very quickly, growing very quickly, and this happens often in sort of the startup sort of world, right? Where this thing has already got a head of steam, and you don't have that IT leader. Maybe the search took 2 or 3 or 4 months, and that was the case with me. They had a fairly long search because they wanted to make sure they found the right person. And so in that 4 months, the business can't come to a standstill, right? So you had other functional leaders doing all sorts of shadow IT stuff, stepping in and trying to unravel that and make sure that there's an enterprise architecture that you can salvage some of this and try and consolidate. And, there's also just the lack of discipline that I encountered in that particular situation when it came to expense. Everything seemed to have been a 30% premium on contracts and multiple vendors overlapping with each other and stuff. So when you step into a role and there's been a void in leadership from an IT perspective, those are really difficult knots to unravel. And it took me a little bit over a year to get it all sort of lined up again. And I don't think that anybody else in the business really even had a comprehension of how bad it was, because they just weren't paying attention to it. And they just trusted what had happened previously and that those budgets were the appropriate budgets allocated the right way. And it just wasn't the case. In fact, when I met with the CEO the first few times that we were trying to formulate a strategy, it seemed to me like he was crystal clear on what he was trying to get done from an IT perspective, what he expected out of his IT function. And when I looked at the pipeline and sort of the backlog of projects, there were maybe 2 or 3 initiatives that were aligned to that strategy and probably 30 or so initiatives that were completely unrelated. And so, again, it's just about making sure that you get very purposeful in the things that you're working on and maximize the value of every dollar. And so it took me a while to get there again, but eventually we got there. And then once you develop that credibility and IT starts to really get moving, then you get a head of steam and the momentum starts to really carry you.
Thank you for that. In your opinion, is AI and this new way of working going to be an IT-led initiative? Is it going to sit in the CIO's wheelhouse or in that section of the business? Or do you think it's going to be business-led? Like, what are your thoughts on where this is going to go?
Yeah, good question. Every organization has a different take on technology, and so is this a technology thing or is it a process thing? My preference is that it sits in the technology realm, and organizations, some of them have a CIO and a CTO and a CDO and all these other roles. And so whatever the organization structure is, I believe that if you don't have a knowledge of governance and of compliance and of security, right, those are the things that get ignored sometimes when IT doesn't have their mitts around it. And so from my perspective, at least, I think it needs to be driven by the technology function, if for no other reason that you can make a really, really disastrous mistake if you're exposing data publicly or whatever. You just need some controls and some governance around that, you might have folks that understand that, but there's no guarantees. We're trained and sort of like, it's in our DNA to think about those things. For other folks, it might be in a sight.
So I'm curious in your opinion on this. So platforms like Salesforce have done a fantastic job of marketing. I think they probably have some of the best branding and ability to paint a picture of what the future looks like. And oftentimes business will see this beautiful image of what's possible and buy into it and want it done tomorrow. Who controls the purse strings to get things done? Is it IT? Is it business? Is it revenue ops? Like if Salesforce is not working the way it should, let's just say it was set up backwards, the company grew, the design where it was 5, 10 years ago doesn't support today, and it's just not going to scale. But there's a lot of desire from the organization to evolve this. Who's the person that can actually go ahead and get it done?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a person. My approach has always been these sorts of things have to be partnership between the folks that are using the software and the folks that are managing the software of the system. And if one is making autonomous decisions without the direct partnership of the other in either direction, right, you're going to miss things. And if IT owns it, then it's not necessarily, depending on who you have, it's not necessarily going to be lockstep. The businesses, the adaptations and sort of organic growth of the business. And likewise, if it's owned by, let's say, the chief revenue officer, and IT is just an administrative arm to onboard employees and make changes or whatnot, then you have the opposite problem, which is you can have architectural sprawl. You're not going to have a clear data model because Salesforce in almost every situation is not going to be on an island or in a bubble. It's going to be interfacing with your NetSuites or your Sages or your Oracles or whatever. And not understanding all that connective tissue, making decisions is really dangerous because you can conceivably do something as simple as add a custom field, right? And it maybe exists in another system with a different name. And now people think it's the same thing, but it's not, just simple things like that, that you think, I don't have to involve anyone. This is a simple, easy decision. And then 3 months later, you realize you've got to untangle the whole thing and re-implement it correctly. So I didn't give you a clear answer there because I don't believe any of these business systems should be owned by IT, but I also don't think that any decision making should be done without strict governance of the technology function playing a heavy role in making sure that nothing can move forward without a solid thumbs up from the IT function.
And that's a really keen insight. I just want to share some tactics that I'm seeing from the kind of from the ground, and would love to hear your thoughts if this is something that you feel would be a good approach that other CIOs can actually implement on Monday.
Mhm.
And that is, if business and IT or those different functions are working together, the first thing every part of that organization and each individual group needs to have is clarity. Clarity. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? What is your goal and mandate that you and your division and department want to do? So for the sales team, they need to have clarity on, where they want to leverage the platform to help them achieve their goals. The IT or the technology department needs to have clarity of how Salesforce fits into the overall picture. And it can be just done on a one page, but write it down and have clarity so that when you're talking to business, you can both be looking at the same diagram that's not technical, but you can say, in order for us to do this, this is kind of how it has to work. And you can come to an agreement. And then from the executive or board team, they can see that by having clarity and having macro view of the entire picture of what's possible, and when budgets ask for, of why it needs to support this greater picture. So I think that's step one that is an important tactical step for CIOs when they're having these discussions around AI or platforms. The second is what I'd call context. And from a context point of view is for everyone to understand what the reality is versus the vision. And what I mean by this is, if you have a sales process that the sales team has written down that they believe is made up of 5 steps, and that's what they're following, that's the context they're living in. And if the reality is that the Salesforce environment has a context reflective of the metadata, meaning how the system is actually designed, and it's 25 steps, then you have a major problem and you have no ability to talk the same language. So I think context of the vision of what you believe to the vision and the context of what reality is critically important. And I think once those two pieces are on the table, there's the conversations that are allowed to be had where you can now have confidence in what the potential of the business is, where there's areas for implementing, whether it's automation or AI or agent force or whatever the new thing is. You need to have those 3 pieces. And I'm curious, from your point of view, have you ever seen those 3 pieces together? Because I very rarely have seen someone who has had that ability to source and to surface that information to have that discussion.
Yeah. One of the things I work really hard on is making sure that I can be the connective tissue between the other functions in terms of how their processes work. I think that if IT can be the master of the data architecture and sort of the have an understanding, maybe not of every little nuanced little procedure, right? But I'm talking about processes, right? How does every function operate and run their business? That's how you can make sure that you're a good partner, that if somebody does something here, it's not going to break something there. And so I've been lucky because, or maybe I've been intentional. I don't know. Either way, it's worked out for me that I've always found people within the functions. It's often maybe not the leader of the function, but a key lieutenant, or, a key lieutenant and maybe their right hand, who have a similar interest in having that cross-functional knowledge. And in fact, just because they've either been around long enough or have good experiences there, they wind up just naturally being attuned to that sort of thing. And so those are the people that you want to make sure before you do anything that you're interfacing with that group of people, because they also have their boots on the ground, right? So while in IT, we understand it conceptually, and, but based on projects that have been executed, you might be closer or further from a specific implementation of something timing wise, but they're in it every day, right? And so if you have those relationships and if you have those partnerships in the business, then you can actually play that role of being the connective tissue across all the different functions. And these folks can keep you honest and make sure that you're not doing anything stupid.
That's really good. So for those CIOs who are now taking that step, being that connective tissue, being the bridge, they now are uncovering maybe the technical debt, maybe the chaos that has existed for many years, and maybe it was inherited, or maybe just it was never looked at.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not aware that in order to achieve scale or to mature the business, there's some significant work that has to be done. In your opinion, where's the best place to get the funding for that to happen? Do you position it as hey, we have a remediation, we've got a cleanup exercise? Or would it be best positioned as, you know, here's this great AI idea we have, but in order to achieve this, we have to fix this? Like, for those CIOs who need to fix the fundamentals and they need the budget to do it, they have to go and source it. What's your recommendation or where they find it? How can they best position it?
Yeah, I think it depends on where the organization is in its technology journey. Some organizations are just sort of getting started, and there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm around these sorts of things. In that case, you probably already have a significant amount of buy-in from the leadership team, and the budgeting is just sort of part of that process, right? But if you're further along and maybe things are steady state and you take over, or you get put into a role where you realize it's not a steady state or it's not as optimized as you want it to be, it really depends on the organization. Like if you're private equity held and you've got a good relationship with maybe your operating partners, maybe that's a good place to start, right? Because they're having those budget discussions all the time. For me personally, I like to be attached to the hip to the CFO. And so, regardless of where the initiative is, having that relationship makes sure that you have your finger on the pulse of cash flow and just sort of how things are going in general. But if you have a problem to fix in a function, ultimately, it's the functional leader that's got to be the one who's ponying up and partnering with you to go get that funding. And again, it's just that the funding mechanism itself is really dependent on the organization. But if there is discretionary budget, then you do your best to try and get a hold of it. I always keep within IT a portion of the budget just for these sorts of initiatives. And so if we can't find it anywhere else, I will fund it myself. Yeah.
Okay. And thank you for that. The reason I was asking is I've run across a number of CIOs who are having a hard time fixing the fundamentals, but if they can spin it as an AI innovation project, AI launch pad, and that just becomes part of the overall program, it's almost immediately assigned funds. And
Yeah.
so trying to provide the
Yeah.
shortcuts on, how to play the game to unlock the funds for the stuff
Mhm.
that is fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, if you're publicly traded, obviously that's a different answer, right? Because then there's the optics associated with certain initiatives driving shareholder value. If you're privately owned, it's a completely different story. And at that point, you're ultimately going to have to appeal to the folks that have the purse strings there. Again, for me, I've been very lucky that I've been able to have, throughout my last few roles, actually, leadership teams that are very technology savvy. And so it's not difficult to explain the problem. The budgeting thing is a separate story, but explaining the problem and at least having recognition that this is something that has to get fixed has not been a problem for me personally. And then, it's just a matter of making sure that you are aligned with what the immediate goals of the company are. And if you can fit it into an initiative that's already there, maybe there's already an AI initiative. I don't personally believe that you just slap AI on and people are going to say, ooh, let's do it. But that it does have some sex appeal. But if you can somehow say, this thing that has to happen, if you do this other thing that you already know is really important is actually going to move a little more quickly. And you can show and prove that, let's say it's an automation, or let's say it's a re-architecture of maybe some data modeling or something like that, right? If you can show that by taking those sort of boring steps that nobody really pays attention to other than you, that those things are actually going to make front end benefits, that's the key, right? But you have to really make sure that, again, that you have a holistic understanding of how everything works together, because if you don't know those things, then you're hoping that by socializing it, that they'll connect those dots for you. And there's no guarantee that that's going to happen.
I think that's very wise. What would be your recommendation or almost your rule of thumb for leaders on the concept of customizing everything versus leveraging out of the box? When, if you were just looking at it from a Salesforce point of view, what would be your recommendation and what are some lessons that you've learned through this?
Yeah. Again, I'm going to be a little bit cynical here, right? Which is the Salesforce implementations that I've been a part of have often had, fairly hefty price tags with fairly, I'd say, bloated project teams and structures, right? And part of what happens in these situations, at least again, in my experience, to be fair, is the implementation partner is designing with the intent of having a long-term stake in the solution. And so they will, again, I'm not trying to be unfair. My perception is that complexity gets built in to guarantee it to be a sticky solution for them, right? Well, they're the only ones that need them, so we'll have to do, a managed service agreement with them. And so I am very much of the belief that these systems are designed with intention. They're designed to be universally applicable, and the degree to which you can use the functionality that like out of the box of the system, use as much out of the box as you can, right? And if your business is really that difficult that you can't adopt some of these because the systems are built oftentimes with a best practice approach in mind. If you can't leverage those best practice approaches, then ask yourself why, right? Is this going to really does this differentiate us, this particular thing that we're so caught up on? Or is it just that we're so used to doing it this way that we just, again, want to have a facsimile of the old system, built into the new system? So customization ultimately has to happen, but it should be to get you from 85% to 100%. It shouldn't be, to get you from 40% to 100%.
Thank you. Do you mind if I share with you a war story of something I had to live through? And it's
No,
public,
I'd
so
love to
I'm
hear
not disclosing it. So back when I worked with IBM, they were looking to implement Salesforce. And there's a lot of really smart people in IBM, but sometimes the engineering mindset thinks that they're a little bit too smart. And so they wanted to take Salesforce as a sales tool and reverse engineer it to be a CPQ first platform. And Salesforce came in and said, it's not designed to do this. Like, please just leverage out of the box and change your business process to map to the best practices and make some changes and iterations, but focus on what it does best. I mean, it was designed to be a core CRM. It was designed for sales. And of course, back and forth, and the entire project ended up blowing up and cost a lot of money. And, I was brought in to do almost the retrospective and almost figure out, well, what happened? And one of the big decisions that was made by one of the SVPs when they launched Service Cloud is, we're not going to change anything. We're going to leverage out of the box. And you need to come to me to prove that your idea warrants a customization or that it is so fundamentally needed that we need to go and actually customize it. So I'm not saying no, but you need to come up with a very good reason for it. And it reminds me of the Zappos way of doing things, which is Zappos says we're a customer service business and we're the best at customer service. So we're going to customize customer service because that's what we've identified ourselves as. But everything else, the other 90% of the business is all out of the box because we're not the best.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if this mindset, this approach is something that companies should be leveraging more and more when it comes to AI, when it comes to thinking through new ways of doing things, is identify what you're the best at. And put all your effort into focusing on simplifying that and leave everything else alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, Is that something that you think is a path that CIOs should be moving towards, or do you think, customize it all you want? That's the path, given your experience.
Yeah, it really comes down to the functional leader that you're partnering with. Change is hard. Sometimes people perceive their path to their ascension to their current role as because, I know these things and this is what got the company here and this is the secret sauce. And when they see something like a Salesforce or some of these SaaS tools that have these more kind of vanilla processes, there's almost like a, yick factor there, like, nah, that's not how we got here, right? And so I've seen it happen both ways, and I don't always win that one. I don't always win that tug of war. Sometimes you have to pick hill you're going to die on kind of thing. It's a little bit of a give and take there, right? You don't want to have a situation where you've got a functional leader that is completely disenfranchised with the process because they don't feel like they're being listened to. And if you don't win, right, if you can't make that sale that, hey, if you just do this, a lot of the other things become easier. If you can't make that sale, sometimes you just have to do your best with what you're given. And maybe it's not optimal, but at least you've got everybody going in the same direction and you don't necessarily have this friction. Because what happens when things go wrong, right? You implement this thing, if you don't get the outcomes that people were looking for, then all of a sudden everyone's looking to see whose fault it is. And if you don't have that sort of alignment throughout the implementation, then that becomes very contentious. That's been my experience. I don't always win every one of those, and I try and give as compelling an argument as I can, but I also don't know, right? You have to trust these folks that they know what the heck they're doing, and that if they really put their foot down and say, no, like this customization is absolutely critical to our business, it is differentiating. Whether you agree or not, you've got to respect their expert judgment and be their partner and help them get the most out of the system that they're looking for.
I couldn't agree with you more. And going back to our earlier conversation of working alongside the business, I think sometimes the role of a CIO in this new leadership role of bringing those facts to the table is presenting truth and saying, I'm not telling you what you should or should not do, but let me present the information of what reality is because you may never have seen it before. And, going back to, this business process concept, if someone's willing to die on a hill because they believe that their business process should be set up in a certain way. But the reality is they've been running it in a completely different way. And the partner you've brought in to do the custom development work has been given a third way. You now have no reconciliation of reality.
Right.
And no one's going to be happy.
Yep.
That's where there's a really good opportunity in today's world with some of these new tools, this new way of thinking. And sometimes it's a fresh mindset to come in and say, I'm not here to influence, but I'm here to present what things really are.
Yeah.
And there's some things that are only coming to the market now that CIOs can really leverage, whether they do it in-house or they bring someone in to help to facilitate those types of discussions where it's not based off of emotion and how things used to be done, but everyone can look at a piece of paper and say, okay, if this is what you want, let's truly map this out. And if it is differentiating, let's lock it in and define it. And if it is different, or if there's ways of improving a 25-step process to 5, and maybe adding a few custom pieces to it, then that's what we should do. And I think there's now an openness for this conversation because AI is shining the light on everything. Because if you don't fix the fundamentals, you just merely accelerate chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the AI as it is already going to introduce chaos. These are not perfect tools. And so you need validation, you need expert judgment. I'll say one more thing about this, just as you were talking through it. I've been in situations where you're getting the very best of the particular function to help with the crafting of the solution. And I've been in situations where you get whoever's got spare cycles, right? And their marching orders are just come to me, I'll help solve problems, but otherwise, do your best. And those become really, really tricky situations because you don't feel like you're always getting the real story, right? You feel like you're like somebody is just perpetuating something that they know and not necessarily thinking about the future. So it's really important. I've had to say no to things. I've learned to say no to things where I don't feel like I've got the right people that are going to partner with me. There comes a point where you just have to go to whoever it is, the functional leader and say, listen, if you can't give me people that can really help transform I'm going to be of no use to you. We're going to spend a lot of time doing something. We're going to implement it, and you're going to be really unhappy with the outcome. And then what, right? If you don't want to have a seat at the table and have skin in the game here, this is not something that you can have your key lieutenant, help me with. They typically don't have the experiences and the judgment to get there.
And I think this is an opportunity to have CIOs or for CIOs look into the marketplace that there's individuals who may have that deep experience who can come in for very short periods of time to complement and assist and provide a perspective to allow for teams to really become empowered. And there's hope for those who have gone through career changes, that there's a need for expertise and depth of
Yeah.
understanding because AI needs these pieces in order to be successful. So I want to, provide some hope for those who are maybe going through some places of frustration, as sometimes AI is being used as the soundbite almost of, this is the justification, but it may not be the reality of what's really happening. As we kind of wrap things up here, Phil, I just want to ask you some rapid fire questions. And this is just personal stuff. It's not IT related, but I would like to get to know you a little bit more. So the first is, what are 2 or 3 books that you typically would recommend to someone who's either starting in their career or just something you say, hey, you have to read these books?
I tell everyone to read The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I've read it myself 4 times. I've got it on a physical book. I think I've got an ebook. I've got it on audio, and I go through it often. For whatever reason, it resonated with me. Um, and so if I were to say like, what's the one book? Like that's one. I also am a big fan of How to Make Friends and Influence People. If you want to be successful in IT today, at least as a leader, it's much more a people job than it is a technology job. Being a good technologist certainly helps, but most of what I've been able to get done over the last, call it 10 years of my career, 15 years of my career, has been more about understanding people and understanding what makes them tick and how to, just how to collectively move the ball forward. And if you don't have those skills, some of those softer skills, you're at a significant disadvantage. Some people, if you're a technologist and you want to just be a pure technologist, I'm sure you can go that route and you can continue to sharpen that sword. But I personally believe that the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People give you the opportunity to look at yourself and then sort of understand what is in your control and what you can do to make personal improvements. And then also, what's out of your control. And so I've read it a bunch of times. I couldn't say more about it. And in fact, I've bought copies for most of the teams that I've led.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So entertainment, are there any favorite movies, TV shows, podcasts that you are just grabbing a hold of, and when it comes out, you just get excited and want to tell people about it?
Funny, I'm not really a TV person. I watch a lot of sports, and usually it's mostly because my wife is into sports, and so it gives us a thing to do. Earlier in my life, I was a movie guy. I've seen pretty much everything now, and so, I'd say the thing that I spent the most time on right now is I like to write, and so I do quite a bit of writing, and so I'll listen to books while I'm kind of writing. A couple of my buddies, we've been playing games together for a while, so we'll get online and we'll play whatever it is that we feel like playing. And I play a lot of basketball. So I've coached for 18 years. I play every Thursday night. And, between basketball and the gym, I try and make sure that I can carry these old knees as far as possible.
Fair enough. What about apps or AI platforms you're using? Anything that's jumped out? Maybe something you've discovered you really love?
Yeah. So, I never had a background in software development. Most of my really close friends are very sophisticated application developers, and have, someone very senior in J&J, another guy who was actually the chief evangelist he was the employee number 1 in the Alexa business. He was my college roommate. And so these guys, I mean, they can write code like nobody's business. I never had that skill, right? I came up through sort of the desktop support into server support, infrastructure and help desk and all that. And I made my way that way. And so I was always very jealous of the fact that they could build something from nothing. And so what I did, once all this AI, so I mentioned earlier the vibe coding thing, I installed VS Code on my computer, and then I got a Claude account. And basically, there's a Claude agent that you can build into your development environment. And then lo and behold, I've built websites, I've built some sort of like, some lightweight apps and stuff like that. And it's fun as heck to do. It is really fun. I like being able to just sort of, orate what I want this thing to do and it can build the damn code. It's unbelievable. And I've actually, in talking to my friends, they've said, and they'll stand by it, that these tools have made them 60, 70% more efficient because they're not floundering with them, right? They're really purposeful about how they leverage these things to make them more efficient. And they're using it to document their work. They're using it to do release notes. They're using it to optimize. I would say the AI is no joke. And that's why you're seeing some of these organizations that are reducing staff, these technology organizations, because you can get significant efficiencies if you know what you're doing.
Have you heard of the Ralph Wiggums concept that I think came out yesterday?
No, I haven't. Tell me about it.
So, from The Simpsons, I'll try to summarize that best I can. So if someone in the comments, recognizes that I'm not phrasing this correctly, I'm raising my hand right now going, I'm not a developer. My
Hmm.
understanding is that, Ralph Wiggum is someone who goes, I'll help, but doesn't actually do anything. And a lot of AI code will sometimes tell you it's complete when it's actually not. And
Hmm.
so this is a way of almost re-injecting the prompt and enforcing it to complete and really validate against itself before it continues on. It's almost a reinforcing loop to say, I'll help, but
Yeah.
really encouraging it to go through the entire process. Because as these AI platforms are able to run, minutes to hours, to, I think it's even up to maybe days right now of, directionless, development, it's really important to make sure that you have the fundamentals that you are able to understand both what it's doing and also to make sure that it's correct. And so I
Yeah.
think having that background is really important so that when you are vibe coding, you're able to confirm the vibe coding. One second here. Sorry about that. And so just one last question here. Do you have a life model or something that you really grab a hold of that you either share with your family or your friends when they say, this really defines Phil? Is there something that jumps out to you?
You know, that's a really good question, and it's a nuanced question, right? One of the things that I like to remind myself is how lucky I've been, and I remind myself every day. So I have a practice where every day, at some point when I get my day moving, I pause and I list in my head and I repeat all the things that I'm thankful for. And it just seems to ground me better in my day. I feel like I'm a better husband, I'm a better employee, I'm a better friend when I keep in mind that none of this is promised. And so when you have real gratitude towards, I've been very lucky, right? I had great parents. They set me up. They paid for my college education. I didn't have all this turmoil early in my life. I've had a very, very lucky and blessed existence. And I have to remind myself of just how lucky I've been. And my kids have it pretty darn good too. And so I make sure that they understand the same thing. Yeah.
Well, Phil, this has been incredibly insightful. We've talked tactical things, we've talked strategic, and also, some of the things that you've learned along your path. Is there anything else you would like to add as a closing remark?
No, I mean, I've enjoyed the time here. I think I'd like to actually catch up with some of your other, I hadn't caught up with some of your other podcasts, but I appreciate you trusting me to give an hour of your time to your listeners, and I hope everyone got a lot out of it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. So I'm going to include in the show notes, Phil's bio and a link to his LinkedIn. And if there's any additional thoughts, Phil, I'm sure you'd be more than happy to have people reach out and ask you for your insights. And once again, thank you for joining Heartbeat, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Great, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Enjoyed this deep dive? Hit like or drop a comment with your biggest Salesforce challenge and subscribe for more tactical insights. Know a CIO who has a story worth sharing? Tag them below or send us a message. We'd love to feature them next.